So as you know, this is the first session of day 2, and we've got an incredible guest with us here. Robert Donaghue, who of course is the new CEO of Squash Australia, and it's great because Robert hasn't been around squash for very long in this capacity. He has a background in sports, and he's been involved in various different sports such as water polo and others. And without further ado, I think we'll get straight into it. Let's have Robert take the stage, and I will disappear from here once again, and then Kanzi will come back and continue on after Robert to take questions. Robert, welcome to the stage.
Thanks, Ushan. Appreciate the opportunity to come and talk to everyone. I think 6 weeks in now, so slowly but surely getting my head around all things squash, but really excited to be involved in the sport, and I think this is a great opportunity for the sport more broadly across the world to share ideas and understand the challenges and opportunities that we've got ahead of us. And I think if anything, COVID over the last 12 months has given sport and I guess the world more broadly an opportunity to think about or reset and reframe how they go about their business. So I don't think we're any different than that, and certainly from a Squash Australia point of view, we're in a rebuild and a reinvigoration stage of the sport, and we're sort of really excited about if you just wanted to flick to the first slide, just to give you a bit of a background from my perspective. I've been involved now in sport for well over 15 years. I worked in HR for about 10 years prior to that, but and I played rugby union was my sport, and I played that here in Australia at a domestic level, and then also had the opportunity to do that over in the UK, in England and Scotland towards the back end of my career. And one of the great things about that sport is the opportunity to meet people and play right across the world. And I think squash certainly has got that that opportunity for players as well. So I sort of started my sports administration career with Scottish Rugby as a development officer, working with kids in schools, teaching them about the game of rugby and introducing them to the sport, and then came back home to Queensland and worked for Queensland Rugby for almost 10 years, and they are the governing body for the sport in Queensland, one of the states here in Australia, and also has a professional team, the Queensland Reds, that plays in the Super Rugby competition. And so I sort of worked there for 10 years in a range of different roles, and finishing as the GM of operations that had responsibility for the community game, the operations of the facility, the stadium that we trained out of and had played out of previously, and also then putting on the game day experience for Super Rugby here in Brisbane. Also had the opportunity to work with World Rugby around the HSBC World Sevens series. So it came to the Gold Coast for a number of years, and when you're talking about sports looking at new ways of introducing participants into the game, Sevens is a really great example of how rugby embraced a new type of sport. The traditional 15-a-side game had started to decline here in Australia, and the introduction of Sevens introduced a whole new range of people into the game, and in particular women. And ultimately, the Australian team won a gold medal at Rio, and that has done enormous things for the game here in Australia, and particularly the women's game here in Australia. And so, all sports, I think, are looking at ways in which that they can think about their sports differently. And certainly that was a success story, although it had its challenges at the start. It certainly was a success story, and being involved in the Olympic Games was a huge opportunity, and then ultimately winning the gold gave us a huge legacy to drive that back here in Australia. I then moved to an Olympic sport, water polo Queensland, as a CEO there for a number of years, and worked with the national body around a range of different events. So we had the FINA World Water Polo League here on the Gold Coast for men, so hosting that competition, and then we went through a process of working with government here and Tourism Board in Queensland in consolidating the national championships for water polo into one single event that came to Brisbane in January each year, and the economic impact of that ended up being equivalent to some of the bigger sports here, bringing a major event to the stadium here. So it gave government an opportunity to think differently about how they fund sport, and not necessarily concentrating on the top end of the game, but 3,500 people plus their associated families all coming into one location for a 2-week period has a reasonably strong economic impact, and so water polo was able to leverage some new commercial income into the game that it didn't previously have access to on the basis of making that decision, and it was a game-changing decision for the sport. And then I spent the last 18 months just prior to COVID working with the Brisbane Bullets in the NBL, and that was a really interesting experience because the NBL down here in Australia is owned by a private operator. So most of the major sports here are run on the traditional federated system, but this is run by an individual, Larry Kesselman, who bought the league when it fell over a number of years ago, and he has essentially invested his own money into bringing that league back and then ultimately having a professional league here in Australia, and it's widely accepted now that it's probably within the top 2 or 3 leagues in the world now, and the NBA, a lot of NBA players now are actually investing in owning those teams. So it was an interesting model to work in. In Australia, and excuse me, and then that brings me to this role here. I did some consultancy work through COVID in sport and with a sport tech company. But the next part of my career, I really wanted to work in a national sporting organisation, a national body, and lead that through a cycle. And really excited by the opportunity to do that with squash here in Australia. So next slide, if I could, please. So we're coming, or the board essentially has worked with our members, and particularly the states, over the last number of months to start to set the direction for where we want to take the sport over the next period of time. And towards the back end of this year, we're hoping to have completed the strategic planning process for the next period. What that period is will be borne out in that process. But right now, we've got 4 pillars and 4 working teams that are working across the areas of participation, performance, profile, and facilities. And I don't think we've invented penicillin there, and most sports here in Australia are working across those pillars. But we obviously want to have more people playing the game more often. We want to make sure that from a performance point of view, we have high-performing players, we have high-performing teams, organisations, and all the systems and the pathways that continue to ensure success at major competitions. Profile, I think everyone's talked about this. Zena obviously talked about it in that session just previous to here about the profile of the sport. So how do we increase the visibility of squash, and how do we increase or make it a better experience when coming and watching and playing squash? And obviously facilities, and no doubt this is not unique to Australia, but the facilities we have here were built back when the game was at its peak, and not a lot of investment has gone into the majority of our facilities here, or they have closed because they haven't been seen as commercial enough for those private operators to keep them, whether they be within health centres or gyms, or whether they be private squash centres themselves. So, a big part of our strategy is understanding how do we find new places to play, more places to play, and modern places to play. So, particularly if we're trying to attract the youth into the game, walking into a squash centre whether that be in a gym or in a health centre, or whether that be in a standalone centre itself, is an attractive place to come into. So I'll just quickly sort of touch on those 4 pillars and some of the challenges or opportunities we've got in there. Next slide, if I could, please. Participation. This is a stark slide, and I've deliberately done that because there's no shying away from the fact that the sport here in Australia, at its peak, is said to have had around about 1 million people playing the game in a year. And it was a game that was synonymous with life here in Australia. And if you talk to people in my generation and older, we were kids of the baby boomers who played the game. And there hasn't been a conversation I've had in the 6 weeks I've been here where someone hasn't said to me, "Oh, my mum and dad played squash," or "I remember squash back in the day when I used to play it." So the great thing about that is that we have a history of the sport here in Australia. We're not trying to introduce a sport to people here that they're not aware of or haven't played before, or hasn't been a success here in the country before. It's had its challenges since that period of time, but it's finding the ways in which how we can ultimately bring back that interest in the sport that it once enjoyed here in the country. And we've probably got a circa 200k of people who have played the sport in some capacity across the country in any one year, whether that be in your weekly pennant competitions, whether that be a social game with a friend at a health centre, or whether that be school programs or junior programs that might be being run in clubs or centres. So it is our biggest challenge, and without people playing the game, clearly then everything else around that, and particularly around our performance and pathway, makes it very difficult for us to continue to perform at that level if we haven't got the volume of people playing the game for us to be able to find that talent. Next slide, please. There's a range of reasons why squash has declined over the years, but one of the biggest challenges we've got here in Australia, and no doubt this is similar in a lot of countries around the world, is the rise of physical activity over sport, and the move away from the traditional club-based participation in sport to a more individualised physical activity participation in sport, and that has been, I guess, the biggest challenge that most sports here in Australia have grappled with, is how do we turn our sport, particularly if it's been a club-based sport or a team-based sport, how do we attract those people who aren't necessarily looking for that type of consuming the sport, and how do we reinvigorate or reinvent ourselves, or how do we find a new version of our game to attract those people to want to come and play a version of our sport. Next slide, please. So Sport Australia actually went through a process and identified through this Future of Australian Sport report of these 6 megatrends that essentially talk about how people are consuming sport here in this country. So a perfect fit up the top there, that's all about the rise of individual sport and the move towards fitness-based activity away from traditional club-based models, and the challenges around, I guess, particularly sport and organised sport, attracting those people. Mainstream to extreme, so this is the rise of lifestyle sports or extreme sports or extreme physical activity sports, your CrossFits, those sort of things. That's also resulted even at an Olympic level, where they've looked at those and introduced some of those sports, BMX, rock climbing, breakdancing even, which has broken our hearts obviously around Paris, but a shift towards the extreme sports. The more than sport, so using sport as a vehicle for healthy lifestyle, addressing obesity, addressing some physical and mental health. How does sport help address some of those societal issues? It's everybody's game, so we've got an aging population here. We've also got a very strong multicultural population here. So how does sport address that? New wealth and talent. This talks about, I guess, the right and many sports have tried to take advantage of that. In rugby, they took the World Cup there. It was a great success. In Super Rugby, they introduced the Sunwolves in Japan, which was not necessarily a success. And even football here in Australia moved from the Oceania Federation to the Asian Confederation, and obviously and all of the benefits that came with being in that federation. So the rise of Asia and our role in that, or our part of that, being Australia. And then the tracksuits to business, which is about, I guess, the market pressures. So at a very simple level, the cost of participating in sport. Some sports, it's becoming more and more expensive every year to play the sport, but also the money available in sport at the highest level that allows athletes to be able to compete at a professional level, and also the impact that has on attracting talent into your sport. So, in a market here where we have 5 professional sports that we're competing with for that talent, a lot of the time we miss out on the best athletes. Because they will go to a rugby or a rugby league or a cricket or a basketball or a football, one of those professional sports where they can make a living as part of that. So, that whole economic impact has a real impact on us from a talent point of view and a retention point of view in terms of how do we get the best talent playing our sport and ultimately performing for us in those major competitions. Next slide, if you could, please. And then obviously, COVID has had a huge impact on sport across the world, and it's been interesting. Sport Australia is now starting to do some research on the impacts of that, and some of the initial impacts that they're identifying. The motivations for physical activity or sport while we're in variations of lockdown here in Australia, and some states had longer and some shorter, but more broadly across the country where there has been restrictions on sport and physical activity. The motivations for people to get out and get involved in sport. Heavy emphasis on that physical health and fitness, and also helping them with the psychological mental health therapy. So being outdoors instead of being caught inside. And also some social connection as well. So obviously with isolation has meant that we weren't able to spend time with family and friends or club mates or within that social scene we would normally have been around. So physical activity has helped facilitate those social connections during COVID. Next slide, please. This one is probably of no surprise, but when you see it, you understand the impact that that COVID has had on our sport. And over on the right hand side there, 97.2% of people who participate in squash did not participate during COVID, and the vast majority of the reason for that is because those centres were shut down, and for people, and there were heavy consequences for doing so. So that's obviously had an impact, or knock-on impact then on centres and the commercial viability of those. And the biggest challenge we've got now is making sure that we can get all of those people who were participating prior to COVID back again, and active in squash, whether that be in the way they used to previously or in some other way. But it's a huge challenge for us. And then when you look on the other side there about the activities that people have been participating in through COVID, you're jogging, you're running, your yogas, exercise at home, bike riding, all of those individual fitness-based sports or activities have been the thing that people have turned to and could very well have fallen in love with during that period of time. And our challenge will be moving people back towards our sport, or finding a way for our sport to I guess attract those people because of some of the elements that we've got in our sport that they also do have through those physical activities. So where I think, and Zena mentioned this just briefly at the back end of her presentation, where I think there's some opportunities for us as a sport We've obviously got that real strong fitness element to the game. You get a great workout in the 45 minutes or an hour that you're in playing a game. It's a short and sharp game. So for those who are time poor, who are just looking for a short activity to get their physical activity, you can do that. You can play with a friend, you can play with your partner, male or female. You can play with a colleague. You don't have to wait for the whole club to be there, or for a training night or on a Tuesday and Thursday to go down and get your physical activity. You can play that with friends, partners, colleagues. You can play it. It's played across many cultures. So there's 20 million people that play squash throughout the world, across different countries, and as they come and live here in Australia, there's a huge opportunity for us to integrate them into our communities through sport, and using squash as a way of doing that. I think is really important, and also gives them an opportunity to play the sport that they love in their new country. It's cost effective still. Any age, any ability can play it. We've got an aging population here, and that aging population played squash back in the 70s and 80s, so it's still a sport that they can play. And we've got a really strong masters scene here still in Australia, on the back of probably that period of time back in the 70s, 80s and 90s. And it can be played anywhere, and I put this in italics because I think there's a real opportunity for us to think differently about what is squash. Yes, there's squash that's in the traditional court, on the traditional floor, with the traditional formats of the game, but even there was talk yesterday about concrete courts, or even if a kid is hitting a ball against a wall with a racket, and there's a line of tape on the wall, that they identify that as squash and not tennis. So then that starts them falling in love with the game from an early age, and it's not reliant upon them going down or finding a squash centre or playing the traditional version of the game. It's a hybrid version of the game, but they're learning the core skills or getting involved in that game, and it's just a matter of switching that from every kid here in Australia at some point in time hits a ball against the wall with a racket, whether that be a tennis racket or a squash racket. So how do we get them to identify that as squash, and then have programs in place that ultimately transition them into to playing the game in its truest form? Thank you. Next slide. From a performance point of view, we've had great success as a nation in squash for a long period of time. 33 medals we've won at Com Games since its inception, and 47 world championships since 1976. And some of the names and or they've stayed playing to help us, in this transition period. And we've got a real challenge now of making sure that we've got the next generation of talent in programs working with us to ultimately have success on that international stage, and also the opportunity to become professionals and play that on the PSA Tour. We've got a real opportunity with our National Training Centre, which was a legacy item out of the Com Games here on the Gold Coast. So we've got 6 courts on the Gold Coast now that our national program operates out of. So there's an opportunity for us, obviously, to have a centralised program, but also for athletes to be able to come at points in time throughout the year and access our national coaches and our national programs. And we've just introduced a Performance Pathways Network with the support of the Australian Institute of Sport and Sport Australia here, where we've got performance pathway coaches now working within each of the states, albeit they're only 1 day a week at the moment. We hope to be able to grow that over time, and the commercial part of the business will help facilitate that. But those roles will be critical for us, working with those athletes in their home states, in their home programs, as they develop, to ultimately then be able to take the next step onto the international stage, and give us that continuity of performance, and us not find ourselves in a situation in another 10 or 15 years' time where we've had a good core group of people come through and be successful for us, but there's nothing coming in behind. And so that's our real focus from a performance point of view at the moment. Next slide, please. Profile and commercialisation. I won't read through all of this, but I think partnerships, digital and major events is where we're going to get a lot of opportunity for here. So, understanding what the assets we have here in Australia from a commercial point of view to build some volume and be able to have conversations with companies, not just companies that are involved in squash, but companies that want to achieve things through sport and how they can partner with us to achieve that. The PSA's obviously done this with In Front, and I've talked to Alex about this. How do we consolidate our digital assets and take control of the digital content here in Australia and package that up so that ultimately we can show that, people can watch it, it becomes something that people can see. Broadcasters here in Australia now have moved from the traditional TV models where it was nearly impossible to get on TV to they're looking for content to fill their channels, and there's opportunities for us if we've got the right content to be able to put that into the mainstream TV networks here or the mainstream online streaming networks here now, and there being a visibility of our product at the top level. Because it's awfully difficult for a kid to aspire to playing squash at the Commonwealth Games or on the professional tour if they can't see it or they've got to go looking for it. And so how do we make that more available for them? And then and that goes hand in hand with major events. So obviously we had the Com Games here in 2018 and that was great. But how, like I said in water polo, how do we understand the economic impact of our events here in the country, and how do we package them up to make that more attractive and we can attract investment in it? Identifying iconic locations. I think everyone tells me, and I've seen them myself. Obviously, the pictures of the glass court in front of the pyramids. Every country has got those iconic locations, and if you're able to do that with your events, then I think that lifts your profile. And Australia has obviously got some real iconic locations that are recognisable around the world. We obviously have to reimagine that event day experience. And for us, the Australian Open, it needs to become one of the premier events in the world that the PSA Tour and the players on that want to come and play and win each year. And we have to have an aspiration to build that over time. That won't happen in a short period of time. But I think if we've got that aspiration, then that ultimately gives us the opportunity to then have an event here where we can leverage enormous opportunity from and we can have kids being able to go and watch the best level of squash here in Australia and aspire to be one of those players one day. Next slide, please. Facilities. I saw this image. I think it was on LinkedIn, and I think this says everything to me about what a squash facility should look like. It's modern. Architecturally, it works. I can think of locations here in Brisbane where this would be fantastic, but most of all, it is visible, and that's our biggest challenge here. And obviously, around the world, is most of our squash centres are hidden within private courts or health clubs, or they're just in buildings that aren't well signed or are dated. So, how do we work with government? How do we work with local councils? How do we work with private operators to modernise our facilities, but also have these facilities which blend in nicely with the modern day architecture and landscapes in which we operate. We've just kicked off our facilities working team here, so that's a big focus for us over the next number of months is to start to identify what are the things that we need to be thinking about in that space and engaging with court owners and operators around how we help them make their businesses commercially viable, but also how we help them modernise them and make them a place where people want to be. Next slide, please. And then last but not least, there's a huge opportunity for us as a sport more broadly, and Zena touched on the Olympic bid and the opportunities around that, but the work the sport needs to do to get to that point. But I think for us here in Australia, a home Olympic Games in 2032 has completely changed the narrative about how sport is going to be funded here in this country. And I think that 2 or 3 weeks ago there was discussions about, well, does sport need, particularly on the back of COVID, does sport need to continue to receive the level of funding it does? But this announcement that potentially Brisbane has those games in 2032 has completely changed the narrative around funding in sport, and ultimately that will benefit us as a national body here, whether we play in the Olympics or not. If government invests more into sport, and obviously the Commonwealth Games is our opportunity at the moment, but if government is investing more in sport, then that gives us an opportunity to continue to grow and continue to perform. But ultimately, and as Zena said, Australia is synonymous with squash, and how great would it be for squash to be introduced in the Olympics in 2032 in Brisbane. We'd be really excited by that opportunity, and obviously we'll work closely with all the federations around the world to put our best foot forward for that opportunity, whether that be in LA or in Brisbane. So I think that was me.
Thank you so much, Robert. We really appreciate your time and for going into all those details. It was very insightful. So we have time for one question before our next speaker goes on. So this is a question from Paul Selby. Shout out to Paul, who was again my first sponsor growing up, head. So Paul is saying, is there enough desire to build new facilities across Australia to cope with the growth in participation, especially as squash in Australia has lost so many facilities over the last 20 years?
I think there is a desire to build more sporting facilities more broadly, and squash needs to get ourselves in the conversation with government, particularly around multi-sport facilities, as as a sport that wants to be involved in those discussions, and how we can connect into those with the other sports that may be building those. Sport government here in Australia doesn't invest very often anymore in single-use facilities. They're very much focused on multi-sport and multi-use facilities, and how men and women can use those facilities. So I think there's an opportunity for us to get into the conversation with government around, if you're building multi-use facilities, how do we become part of that discussion and influence those local councils or those clubs that are building those to be part of any development. But it will be a challenge, no doubt.
Thank you so much, Robert. So just so you know, you will only be able to exit the session after the whole session ends. I just wanted to ask you if you will be available to go to the lounge after the session so that people can ask you their questions, because we have so many questions for you. Yeah? Okay, amazing.
Yeah, no
so
problem.
For all the attendees, after the session ends, feel free to go to the lounge and find Robert, and then you can ask him all of your questions. Thank you so much, Robert.
Thank you.